big fan of films like Pulp Fiction, I thought I'd start at the end, maybe with a little less profanity, just to give you a sense of where we're going. Okay, thanks. So holding space for psychedelic journeys is a multifaceted and transformative process that invites the space holder into a deep exploration of presence, attunement, and service. And over the course of sort of the next 25 minutes or so, I want to share with you why this is important. I want to talk with you a little bit about how it looks in practice. And also, perhaps most importantly, I want to talk about what this could mean for the future of psychedelic practitionership. Got a couple of things going at once here. And so none of this is going to be new to any of you, but as psychedelic therapy starts to move into the mainstream, what we're witnessing is an increased focus in wanting to better understand how do we optimize outcomes and how do we reduce harm. And what that's actually meant is that we've begun to focus a lot more on looking at set and setting, which is why we're all here, the sorts of things that we're talking about here. So we're looking at things like dosing strategies, some of the things that we've been talking about here, dosing strategies, different therapeutic protocols, different approaches, and interest in how we might work with set and setting far more intentionally and far more effectively is actually starting to rise. And as I said, I'm assuming that most of you are fully aware of set and setting and what it's all about. This idea, obviously made famous by Timothy Leary. And so research and exploring things like pre-dose mindset states and traits, the factors that might influence challenging experiences. Those are the sorts of things that we're starting to see. And I'm really happy to see, just to hear from the two speakers beforehand, just to hear a little bit more about some of the other things that folks are actually thinking about. But what I think is really important to consider is that the studies have focused primarily on the experience of the journeyer, right? The person who's undergoing the psychedelic substance, right? And they're looking at things like how to prepare the journeyer, how to measure the journeyer's state of readiness. Those are the sorts of things that we're seeing. And even though therapeutic alliance has widely been recognized as a really critical factor in outcomes, there's not a lot of attention that's really been given to understanding the experience of the space holder, what's happening for them, and in order to perhaps even correlate how that might impact. And I was really happy to hear what Sean had to say. I was really interested in that. I'm going to dive more deeply into that. And I think it's also really important to point out that space holder plays a very big part in informing both set and setting. And so I see that as a really critical thing to look at. There was a study in 2024 that was seeking to better understand the qualities and the skills required to hold space for psychedelic experience, and they highlighted holding space as a really key competency. And so that leads to the question, what if the key, potentially, to unlocking the therapeutic potential of psychedelic experience lies not just in the substance, but also in the space, the empty space around it. And so what is holding space? It's a familiar term, especially if you've been involved in the caregiving communities, maybe the spiritual community, perhaps the leadership community. Holding space is a term that we've been talking about for a very long time, and I think to some degree everyone has held space, or at least believes they may have held space. But the definition that I'd like to share with you is one from Heather Plett, and the author of The Art of Holding Space. And this definition is really informed by lots of different schools of thought and lots of different particular thinkers too. Holding space is walking alongside another person in whatever journey they're on without judging them, making them feel inadequate, trying to fix them, or trying to impact the outcome. Again, just one definition of holding space, but it really does encompass a lot of schools of thought. And so holding space it's a concept that is really, it's rooted in indigenous practice and customs. But more than just listening, which is what we might often think about it, and what we might also think about it when we're holding space, more than just listening, holding space asks something a little bit deeper of us. So Harrison Owen puts it quite succinctly, and when he refers to it as total presence and absolute invisibility. I just want to say that again, total presence and absolute invisibility, and maybe even invite you to consider what it might take for you to embody that. Total presence, absolute invisibility. And so holding space for non-ordinary states of consciousness is a practice that also originated with ancient and indigenous mystics and shaman and curanderos. And while many of those indigenous ceremonial aspects, things like music and the use of ritual, while we use those things in the way that we hold space for psychedelic experience today, there's still a real degree of mystery that kind of swirls around the experience of the spaceholder themselves. You don't necessarily know what's going on for them. And so what does it take to be an anchor in a sea of cosmic consciousness? Recognizing that there might be some real value in understanding not just what holding space looks like, but how it feels, how it impacts the practitioner and those around them. I set out to investigate and to illuminate the experiential essence of holding space for psychedelic journeys. And so part of what was the impetus for this was that the space is expanding, right? There's training programs popping up everywhere. There's a sense that we're getting that there's a need, or there will be a need, for more trained practitioners. And so wanting to better understand how do we develop these practitioners, it stood to reason that we really want to understand exactly what the experience of the practitioner might be. And so I wanted to explore really what it's like to inhabit this really critical role. And ultimately, what I was looking to do was to identify universal tones of experience that might really contribute to a deeper understanding of how to prepare and how to support practitioners. And so I initiated a phenomenological study of the lived experience of holding space for psilocybin journeys. And the study included very detailed interviews and discussions with 8 experienced practitioners, facilitators, who represented diverse contexts, quite diverse contexts. So the criteria were that they had to be at least 18 years old, but I didn't speak to any 18-year-olds. The minimum age in the end was 34, and they ranged from age 34 to 67. The criteria was also to have had held space for the minimum of 50 experiences. And then beyond that, I was really interested in speaking with people who held space in various contexts. So everything from clinical, and what I mean by clinical is it speaks more to the relationship. So clinical meaning individuals who were working typically one-on-one, and they were looking at addressing some specific pathology, maybe a depression or anxiety or addiction, and they would have been clinically trained people. So clinically trained all the way through non-clinically trained. So by that I mean people who may have been trained, depending upon whether you consider it clinical or not, in more the caregiving fields. So counselors, coaches, that sort of thing, all the way through ceremonial context. So people who may have been working with groups, who may have been trained by in an approach that was a little bit more. They had a mentor, that sort of thing, or who may have been trained in more indigenous ways, indigenous practices, and so the study included across all of that. Of course, I think that's probably my phone ringing. Is it? I'll erase all of it. Again, diverse training backgrounds. And so I was really interested in hearing their full stories, right? I didn't just want to have them complete a questionnaire. I wanted to explore the nuance of the work. I wanted to hear about it from them and really get a sense for how it feels in their own words. And so what I can say is that the conversations were very rich, very, very deep. And the analysis, the thematic analysis of the work was also quite deep and at times quite moving. And so ultimately, through the process of a thematic analysis, I was able to identify about 8 key experiential themes. And for the purposes of this, because I've only got a short period of time, what I've actually done is I've taken those things and I've condensed them down into just a few key insights, which I'm going to kind of take you through. What I will do as well as I start to talk you through the data is just in order to kind of connect you with the experiences of the participants themselves and to give you a more intimate understanding of their experiences, I will share some of the information through their own words. Starting with the response to the question, what does it mean to hold space for psychedelic experience? To be with someone as they expand or as they contract. To be a safe place for people to go to unsafe places. And so the practitioners that I spoke to, they identified safety as their primary focus and their primary concern, and they sort of equated the experience of holding space to being a physically and an emotionally and a spiritual safe place for people to go to unsafe places. So the conversations with them really centered on this concept of containment, and the work of creating these multi-dimensional containers to hold the experience, all the way from the very first contact, all the way through preparation and the journey itself through to some point in the integration, the process of integration. So across the entire arc of the experience. And so the containers are really defined by things like boundaries, and there's obviously physical aspects to the containment as well. If you think about the spaces where these things are taking place, there's emotional and energetic aspects to the experience of containment, all focused on really trying to build trust and support, something that's going to support that journey unfolding. Each element, every single element communicating to the individual journeyer that on some level of their being that they're safe to go where they need to go and to be who they need to be. And so the practitioners really talked about the importance of creating this container in a way that gives some structure, right? Enough structure that there's a sense of holding, but also some flexibility, right? Some flexibility that'll allow for the experience to unfold organically. So that's a really important aspect of this container. And they also shared some of their experiences of creating containment, which included things like ritual. So it might have been, ritually setting up the space. It might be their own personal rituals for preparing, various, practices that they undertake themselves just before ceremony, or perhaps, just before sessions, or perhaps, just before any interaction with the client, whether that's the very first interaction or any other interaction throughout. They talked about introspection. So they talked about tuning in to themselves, noticing their own mental and emotional, energetic rhythms, softening to become a more receptive space. And then they also talked about things like connection, as you would imagine. So tuning into the energy of the journeyer, of the space, making a real intentional connection to the intention, their own intention, and the intention of the journeyers themselves. Paying attention even to things like the temperature in the room, the music, any ambient noises in the room, in the space, the light in the space, whether it was natural light or artificial light, the place of the sun, if there's natural light, and how the light might shift throughout the journey. And for some of them even talked a little bit about seasonal considerations. So the impacts of the particular impacts of the seasons on the individuals themselves, or even on the participants. And so they all really spoke about this idea of containment, absolutely universal amongst all of the participants. They talked about containment, either explicitly, referring to it perhaps as containment, or implicitly, their stories might have centered around this idea of containment and the role of containment as an incredibly critical support for deep and potentially liberating exploration for the journeyer. And one of the participants expressed it this way: when we have containers, we can go to infinite expression, which I thought was really beautiful. And that brings me to the first key insight. Containment is the essential foundation of the work of holding space for psychedelic experience. It's creating the conditions where profound allowing and profound exploration becomes possible. And so the practitioners that I spoke to also really emphasized that maintaining an effective container does really require an extraordinary presence, a quality of being more than doing. And it was expressed kind of far more eloquently than that by one of the participants this way: I'm very aware of my heartbeat. I'm very aware of their heartbeat. I remain the anchor to the space, and they get to go further. And so once the container has been established, facilitators enter into what I would like to call a dance of attunement, right? This dynamic kind of moment-to-moment awareness that kind of moves between the self and other and the space in between. And this attunement really does happen simultaneously on multiple levels, the physical level, and facilitators kind of describe watching the body language and noticing the shifts in breathing and maintaining this compassionate resonance, close enough really to understand, but yet grounded enough to remain a really stable anchor for the whole process. And perhaps the most fascinating part is this energetic and intuitive part of it, this intuitive and energetic dimension of the attunement. So many of the participants really did describe sensing things that were kind of transcend ordinary perception and ordinary knowing. These aspects of the journeyer's experience that they were able to kind of connect with without any real verbal communication, and almost kind of pointing to, like almost like a telepathic sense to it. All of them discussed in some way this sort of feeling of shifts in the energetic field, whatever that meant, however that showed up for them, maybe shifts in their own sense of emotion or even sort of subtle feelings that were happening for them. Receiving intuitive insights about what might be necessary. and what might be needed in any particular moment. And so this heightened attunement really does coexist with this a profound comfort with the unknown. And I'll say comfort with the unknown, not necessarily just awareness or tolerance for, but a comfort with the unknown. So facilitators did really talk about the importance of remaining open to whatever comes, right? Releasing any preconceptions about how things should be, how it should unfold. One participant even really talked about this idea of being agnostic, right? Acknowledging that something is happening, but I'm not sure what is happening, and I don't really need to know what's happening or define it or control it. I can just allow it. And so central to this sort of kind of dance of attunement is this recognition that the facilitator is not the healer. Yeah. They're creating the conditions for the journeyer's own healing intelligence to emerge. So participants across all of the different contexts that I spoke with, they really did emphasize the importance of stepping back, of allowing this process to unfold organically rather than trying to direct anything or create anything to be a certain way, which can be quite challenging sometimes, especially if you're coming from a caregiving, a kind of a more traditional caregiving or therapeutic role. And so this kind of complex interplay of awareness and attunement and allowing, again, they emphasize that it requires capacities that might tend to extend beyond our conventional therapeutic space-holding skills. Right? They express that it calls for this level of embodied presence that can only really be developed through your own personal practice and a willingness to navigate and to explore the territory of non-ordinary states yourself. And so that's bringing me to my second key insight here, which is, the essence or the effective facilitation, I should say. It does really require developing some capacities that might extend beyond our conventional therapeutic skills that we think about, right? Including things like somatic awareness, energetic attunement, and above all, and perhaps even the most challenging, is, as I sort of emphasized before, this comfort with mystery, right, with not knowing. And so one of the most compelling insights of this research is the fact that this whole process is truly reciprocal. And so I'll share these two. Sometimes the way we return to our own healing is through holding space for other people. And one of the other participants said, it's helped me to love myself more because you have to find the love for yourself. You have to. Right? So there's this reciprocal nature. All of them talked about that to this process of holding space. And really, unlike kind of more traditional therapeutic models where the practitioner kind of often stays outside of the process, of the client's experience, all of the space holders, again, describe this work as very deeply mutual. Right? This very deeply transformative, not just for the journeyers, but for them as well. So they talked about how that really does unfold for them through the creation of their own personal practices, those practices that they use to stay grounded and stay present, right? They talked about the practices that range from meditation to time in nature to time with their families and their communities. The approach is varied, but the message was very consistent that personal practice is a very key and critical part of all of this. And at the core of this sort of reciprocity is the facilitator's own relationship with psychedelics. And I know that's in some ways kind of a contentious idea these days, or a contentious subject sometimes in some spaces. But every one of the practitioners that I spoke to talked about how critical it was for them to have their own experiences with psychedelics just to get a sense of the lay of the territory and better understand how to work with things across the board. And then also many of them really did talk about how this work has kind of sparked some personal awareness within themselves about and supported their own healing journeys. Personal awareness about some of the things that they actually are challenged with or they're struggling with themselves. Another theme that came through very, very clearly was a shift in perspective. So facilitators talked about moving beyond this sort of individual focused thinking towards something deeper, a deeper sense of interconnectedness. Right? They talked about how healing doesn't happen in isolation, it happens in relationship. And of course, the reciprocal nature of this whole thing also does bring about some real challenges. They talked about holding space through difficult or incredibly intense experiences and how that can take a toll on them. And so again, this sort of reinforcement of the need for them to embrace and to emphasize self-care in order to show up for this work with a kind of integrity. And that brings me to the last key insight. So this transformative container is truly mutual. Facilitators are not just holding space. They're part of this shared and mutual exchange that where their own healing and their own growth can often unfold alongside the journeyers. And this, again, is just a concept that's just quite different to a traditional kind of Western therapeutic approach, which can tend to be a little more transactional than relational. And so what is at the heart of holding space for psychedelic journeys? Beyond all of the themes that I've explored here, what's the essential nature of this practice? I'll share another quote quickly. Hold on a second, I'm clicking through myself. There you go. It is dynamic. Yeah, it's fluid, it's living, it tests us in every way, and deep down, it's a calling. And so at its core, holding space is this delicate dance, right, between seemingly opposite forces. Yeah, it's creating safety whilst embracing the unknown. It's being fully present while stepping back, right? It's maintaining structure while allowing for freedom. And this balance isn't something that facilitators achieve once and then have to maintain. It's a moment-to-moment attunement that truly requires both skill and quite a bit of surrender. And so really what makes holding space so powerful is that it's not just a set of techniques to be mastered. It's a way of being that emerges from deep personal work and genuine reverence for the process. And so what are some of the implications very quickly? And so we are at a moment of evolution, right, in the psychedelic practice and in psychedelic care. We're at this place where we face kind of both a opportunity and a challenge. So currently the way that we are approaching training, there's various gaps. They're very much informed by our kind of more traditional approach to training therapists. So there's gaps there. We're choosing protocols really over presence in terms of what we're emphasizing. Right? There's really an insufficient emphasis on the inner development work that needs to happen. There's more of a focus on the doing rather than the being. And so the research kind of suggests more research, really, but it also suggests maybe some potential new ways of looking at things, training that incorporates more somatic and transpersonal elements, right? Communities of practice for psychedelic facilitators to work with each other, to kind of work on their own, to be supported in exploring their own work and emphasizing their own work. Obviously, personal experiences, more personal experiences with psychedelics, and again, prioritizing, again, their personal practice. And then finally, So I think what facilitators in this study really have demonstrated is that the most effective spaceholders truly do embody a quality of connection to service. Yeah, a state of being that, again, just emerges from personal practice, from ongoing self-work, from a deep respect for the process. And so I invite each one of you, whether you're involved in training or practice or research or advocacy, to consider a little bit of a call to action. You know, as psychedelic practice becomes more formalized, it's essential that we design training programs and communities that go beyond technical competence to nurture the presence and the discernment and the humanity that make this work truly impactful. Thank you.